There's a man who sits on the corner of 5th and Main every day. His clothes are old, worn out from years of use, and his shoes are barely holding together. His hair is messy, and a thick beard hides his face, but if you look closely, you can see the pain in his eyes. His name is Jake, but no one around here knows that. To them, he's just the guy on the street. Jake didn't always live this way. Once he had a family, a job, and a home. He worked at a factory, putting in long hours to make ends meet, but things changed fast. His wife left him, taking their young daughter. Then the factory closed down, and he found himself unemployed. Every day he sent out resumes, but no one called back. Bills piled up, and soon he couldn't afford rent. It wasn't long before Jake found himself living on the streets. He found a spot near the bus station, where he could sleep at night, trying to stay warm with a tattered blanket. During the day he'd sit on the sidewalk, asking for spare change. Most people ignored him. Some even gave him dirty looks, but Jake didn't mind anymore. He'd grown used to being invisible. The days blended together. It wasn't about dreams or hopes anymore. It was about survival. Jake didn't expect much out of life. He was just getting by, one day at a time. Sometimes he'd think back to better days, but the memories felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. Life to Jake was nothing more than a struggle. But one day, everything was about to change. He had no idea that this ordinary day would turn his life upside down. It was a cold morning, like most others, and Jake was sitting on his usual corner, wrapping his arms around his knees to keep warm. The sound of passing cars and footsteps filled the air, but no one paid him any attention. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten in hours, maybe longer. He glanced down at his jacket pockets, empty, as usual. Jake noticed a crumpled piece of paper, lying on the ground near the curb. At first he thought it was just trash, like the many other scraps of paper people threw away without a second thought. But something about it caught his eye. He reached out and picked it up. It wasn't just trash, it was a lottery ticket, covered in dirt but still readable. Jake stared at it, confused. He didn't buy lottery tickets. He couldn't afford that kind of luxury. It felt almost like a joke, like life mocking him. Still, he couldn't help but wonder. The ticket was for a big drawing, one of those multi-million-dollar jackpots. He'd seen the advertisements on TV before, but it seemed like something that only happened to other people, people with money, people who didn't live on the street. He didn't know why, but Jake decided to keep it. Maybe it was the curiosity, or maybe it was just the idea of holding something that could change his life. He shoved the ticket into his pocket and forgot about it for a while, as he sat there, hoping for a few coins or a kind soul to pass by. But in the back of his mind, the ticket lingered. Later that day, after the usual rush of people had passed, Jake pulled it out again. He examined it carefully. For a moment he thought it might be worthless, just a piece of paper. But then, on a whim, he checked the numbers, thinking it couldn't hurt. To his surprise, the numbers matched. All of them. Jake blinked, staring at the numbers on the ticket and then at the ones on his phone. He checked again. The same numbers. His hands shook as he held the ticket closer to his face, his heart pounding. It couldn't be real. He rubbed his eyes and looked again. No mistake, he had just won the lottery. The jackpot. For a few seconds, Jake felt completely still, like the world around him had stopped. He couldn't make sense of it. This kind of thing didn't happen to people like him. He had always heard about it, people finding fortune, winning big, but those people were lucky. They had a life. They weren't living on the streets, struggling to find food. How could it be him? The ticket didn't lie, the numbers matched, and the prize amount, millions of dollars. His heart raced, and for the first time in years, he felt something other than hunger and exhaustion. He felt hope, but even as excitement rushed through him, doubt crept in. Was it really possible? Could he really have won? What if it was a scam? What if the ticket wasn't valid? Jake's mind raced as he began pacing back and forth. He almost didn't know what to do with himself. He could barely wrap his head around the idea of having that kind of money. He looked at the ticket again, almost expecting it to change or disappear, but no. It was still there, the proof that his life could change in an instant. After a few minutes of frozen disbelief, Jake did what he thought was the next logical step. He went to a nearby store to check it. The clerk behind the counter raised an eyebrow when Jake, looking disheveled and nervous, handed over the lottery ticket, but the machine beeped, and the clerk's eyes widened. "Is this for real?" the clerk asked, his voice tinged with shock. Jake could only nod, still unable to process what was happening. His hands felt clammy, his knees weak. "Yeah," Jake mumbled, "I think it is." Jake could barely believe it when the clerk told him the news. The ticket was real, it wasn't a mistake or some kind of trick. He had won millions of dollars, right there in his hand. But the overwhelming feeling of disbelief didn't fade as quickly as the excitement had built up. He had to claim the prize. He had to go to the official lottery office, but it felt like a dream, like this wasn't really happening. Walking out of the store, Jake felt a strange mix of emotions: excitement, fear, confusion. He felt like everyone around him knew something he didn't, like they could see that his life was about to change. They probably didn't notice him much before, but now, as he walked down the street holding that ticket, he couldn't shake the feeling that the world was watching. He had never felt more out of place. When he finally reached the lottery office, his nerves were at their peak. The building looked fancy, all sleek glass and polished metal. He stood at the door for a moment, unsure of what to do. His clothes were old and ragged, and he felt dirty from days of living on the street. But this was it. This was the moment he had dreamed about. Jake stepped inside, and immediately the receptionist looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in his appearance. He walked up to the counter, his palms sweating. I have a winning ticket," Jake said, his voice shaky. The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. He handed her the ticket, not knowing if she would believe him. She scanned it, and the machine beeped again. She looked at Jake, then back at the screen. Her eyes widened. This is real," she said, her voice softening. Jake couldn't help but let out a nervous laugh. It was finally happening. He was really going to get his money. The clerk handed him a form to fill out, and for the first time in years, Jake felt a flicker of excitement. Jake stood in the lottery office, filling out the paperwork, but his mind was a million miles away. He could barely focus on the forms in front of him, the words blurring as his thoughts raced. He had just won a fortune, more money than he'd ever imagined, but what was he supposed to do with it? The first thing that came to mind was to get off the streets. He could rent an apartment, buy a car, maybe even get a job again, one that didn't involve begging or surviving day to day. But then something tugged at him, something deeper than the pull of his own comfort. He thought back to the other homeless people he saw every day, the ones who had no ticket, no way out. They were stuck, just like he had been. What about them? Jake had spent so many years feeling invisible, forgotten, like no one cared, but now he was in a position to make a real difference. He could be the one to help. As he sat there in the office, his decision began to form. Instead of rushing to buy a new wardrobe or a fancy car, Jake decided to take a different approach. He knew he needed a place to live, but he wasn't going to let the money change who he was, or the values he held. He walked out of the office that day with the check in his hand, but his mind was set on something bigger. Jake rented a small apartment, not in a fancy building, but in a modest, quiet area. It was simple, but it was his, and that wasn't the biggest part. He started thinking about how he could use his newfound wealth to give back. So he made his first move, not by indulging in luxuries, but by helping others. He used some of his money to buy a shelter for people living on the streets, a place where they could get warm, have a hot meal, and sleep safely. But it didn't stop there. Jake reached out to organizations that helped the homeless, offering donations to provide resources for people who had been forgotten, just like he had been. He also spent time with those who were still struggling, sitting with them, talking to them. Jake shared his story with anyone who would listen, not to boast about his win, but to let them know that change was possible, that someone cared. This wasn't the kind of thing most people would expect from a lottery winner, but it was the only thing that felt right to Jake. He was determined to make his first move count, not just for him, but for others who had been left behind. Jake's story didn't stay a secret for long. News outlets quickly caught wind of the homeless man who won the lottery and the unusual way he chose to spend his newfound wealth. The media, always hungry for a headline, found themselves fascinated by the man who had, instead of splurging on luxury cars and lavish vacations, decided to help those in need. At first, the reactions were mixed. Some people praised Jake for his kindness, calling him a hero for helping those less fortunate. His decision to use the money to open shelters, provide food, and donate to various homeless programs touched many hearts. Stories about him were shared online, and soon, Jake's name was all over social media. The hashtag #JakeTheHero started trending, and people from all over the world sent messages of support and admiration, but not everyone was impressed. There were others who couldn't understand why he hadn't used the money for himself first. Some even criticized him, saying he was foolish for giving away so much of it. Why help others when you could help yourself first, they asked. Why not buy yourself a nice house or a car? In the streets, people began to approach Jake with a mix of curiosity and awe. Some recognized him from his days on the corner, while others had seen his story on the news. They wanted to thank him for what he had done, to tell him how his actions had inspired them, but others were less kind. Some tried to take advantage of him, asking for money or a handout, now that they knew he had it. Jake tried to keep his distance from the negative reactions. He didn't let the criticisms or praise distract him from his mission. As the attention grew, so did the pressure. Jake realized that the world now saw him as something more than just a homeless man. It saw him as someone who had the power to change lives. And he wasn't about to let that opportunity slip away. As the weeks passed, Jake's life began to shift in ways he never expected. The money, once a dream come true, had brought him both happiness and unexpected complications. While he continued to help the homeless, setting up more shelters, and even starting programs for job training and education, his personal life became more complicated than he'd imagined. Jake found himself struggling with the attention. He was constantly approached by people asking for donations, business opportunities, and advice. Many saw him as a symbol of hope, while others wanted something from him. The generosity he had shown to others was returned in the form of people pulling at him from every direction. He felt torn between helping those in need and protecting his own peace of mind. He realized that the more he gave, the more was expected of him. Some of the pressure came from the media, who wanted regular updates on his story. They followed him everywhere, hoping for a scandal or a twist in the tale. It wasn't just about the money anymore. Jake had become a figure, a symbol of redemption, and it was hard to navigate the new expectations placed on him. Despite the attention, Jake stuck to his principles. He didn't let the fame or the fortune change who he was at his core. He continued helping others, though he now did so with more caution. He was still the man who had nothing, the man who had seen the worst of life, and he refused to let that part of him fade. His life had changed in so many ways, but Jake knew one thing for sure: no matter how much money he had, the true reward was in making a difference, no matter how small, and that was enough for him.